Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Karen Graves Cocon. Let's get into the video. In today's video, we're going to be continuing our political theories series, and so definitely check out the rest of those videos. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about libertarianism. So it's an ideology that many people haven't heard of, and those who have probably have a very limited view of it and of its history. So that's what we're going to dive into in this video. Before we do any of that, you know what time it is. I see you there, sitting there, watching them their videos, not getting, you're getting all that knowledge. But you know, you don't want to share the love, baby. You don't want to like and subscribe, but you should. You know you should. Hey, that was hella cheesy. But anyway, long story short, like and subscribe. Yeah, write some comments on the thing. You know, it really helps out the channel. Share it with your friends, anyone who might be interested. And the same thing with all the other videos. And obviously we've got plenty more coming. We do 3 times a week. So we show clips on a Tuesday, and we released like 2 videos on a Thursday and a Sunday, just to give some heads up with the channel, because some people have been really confused with this. I typically have filmed enough stock so that I'm always 2 weeks ahead. So I'm actually filming now, for instance, on the 20th, which is, it said like, so the 19th of 19th September, that was the 1-month anniversary of the channel actually launching. So it's been really like, been really humbling, yeah, like seeing like the amount of support I've been getting already. Like I've got almost 600 views, which isn't a lot in the grand scheme of things, but I have every confidence that I'm going to look back in like a year's time at this channel and just, you know, see how it's gone. And for those of you who have been here from the start, then I really appreciate it. And for everyone else jumping on it, then, you know, really love goes out to you lot, yeah. So yeah, like I'm having a lot of fun like doing these videos, in case you couldn't tell. So with that said, let's jump into the video. Now, just to give an idea of just how obscure this political ideology is that some people, it's a thing of, even when I was at university, some of my university lecturers didn't even know what a libertarian was, right? And so delving into it, oftentimes we have this view of libertarianism as being on the so-called right of politics, but actually, in terms of looking at the history of it, the first use of the word actually came from post-revolutionary France, and you know, became popularized in France and England during the course of the 19th century. And actually, in the early days, you know, the first person who actually used it as an ideology was actually a French communist called Joseph Déjacque. See, my French pronunciation is still terrible, but yeah, he was the first one who kind of like came up with it as a political ideology. Now, this might sound quite counterintuitive to a lot of present day libertarians, because they're like, how can a communist be a libertarian? Now, I think we've mentioned this before with regard to the political spectrum. So there's right and left, then there's also authoritarian and libertarian, okay? So if people are opposed to centralized like authority, like if they're opposed to being told what to do and stuff, right? If they want people to live in a free society, then they are, you know, libertarian, right? So you could be from the left or from the right, and still like arguably be a libertarian, right? So in the early days, it was a belief that you could have all the kind of like social protections and stuff that many people on the left kind of like argue for you know, for the poor, to make sure that they have this, make sure they have that, etc., etc. But by and large, it's a thing of having a free society, having an open society, whereby people are, you know, free to kind of come and go and like live their life as long as they're not harming anyone else, right? So so when we kind of get this into our heads, that libertarianism hasn't always been a right-wing ideology, then we're able to explore like the concept in like a wider context. Now, elements of this video are going to be relatively personal, in the sense of, unlike many of the other videos, I haven't really kind of delved into much of like me and any of my beliefs, right? But I've kind of done that for a purposeful reason. This channel, especially in its early stages, I want it to be a thing where it educates people, and I don't really want it to steer in different directions, yeah. But just a very, very small snippet is a thing of when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I was curious as to what the different ideologies were in terms of I'd always been interested in politics just because of the nature of the family I was from, and we've always been quite open-minded to different things. So reading this, reading that, and so I think at the time I'd read the Communist Manifesto, Mein Kampf, and I think those were the only two, right? So those are obviously two quite kind of extreme ideologies, right? And I hadn't really been introduced to anything that one could consider kind of classical liberal or anything from the Enlightenment period at all at that point. And so when I, stumbled on the workings of Thomas Paine, it really was a game changer for me. It really altered the complete course of like my life in terms of like how I look at things, right? So Thomas Paine, he was a very revolutionary person at the time of the Enlightenment. He was born in England, but he was very influential with regard to the American Revolution. He played a hand in the French Revolution. For him, he wanted to. He was kind of the embodiment of Enlightenment ideas of throwing over the old order, whether that be like monarchy or organized religion or all these different like things, right? So in his books, Common Sense, so in Common Sense, that's where he argues against monarchy and for American independence. In the Age of Reason, this is where he critiques organized religion, especially like kind of the Bible or this or that, right? And in The Rights of Man, he kind of lays out what he believes ought to be kind of the basic rights of human beings. So, and then finally, in Agrarian Justice, he talks about how those in the country with money and stuff should still through the government should give everyone a lump of money both when they're 18 to help them like get started off in life, and also when they're 65 to help them in retirement, right? So this guy was like way ahead of his time, like kind of like thinking about different think about like the welfare state, but then also like laying a lot of foundations for what we think of as like kind of like libertarian thought and stuff, right? And just like classical liberal thought in general. So obviously you had other like philosophers like John Locke and et cetera, right? But this guy was he's really like a force to be reckoned with, like kind of like in his time and stuff. And he was really radical. So I really highly recommend like kind of reading all of Thomas Paine's work. It's not that long to read. It's the English that it's written in is still understandable for people of our generation. And in the future we are actually going to do videos, not only just talking about great people's lives, but also we're going to be doing book reviews. So definitely stay tuned for future videos on those sort of things. Now, in the 19th century, this is where we start to see more of a divergence, between left libertarianism, which kind of borderlined on like kind of conventional anarchism, which again is like anarchism again can either be left wing or right wing, but typically it does actually manifest more as a left wing kind of ideology, and then obviously with the people who right-leaning libertarians and anarchists, right? So we start to see this divergence more and more. And in 1871, Carl Menger writes his famous book, The Principles of Economics, in which he really starts to lay out like kind of the principles of like free market economics, right? And this led to the creation of what became known as the Austrian school for economics, right? So people who are Austrian school thinkers, right? They people like obviously Carl Menger, people like von Mises, people like Friedrich Hayek, right? And all of these people were very influential. So they argued that in terms of creating the greatest level of prosperity for like the most amount of people, right? They argued for free market capitalism. So they argued that the state, other than protecting property rights, should have as little interference in the running of government as possible, right? Because they believed that by having state intervention, that you distorted the price signals, yeah, and that basically the market wasn't able to react properly. So then you'd end up having these, so the boom and bust cycle that we have with economics, yeah, where the economy grows and it grows and it grows and grows, and then it gets to a certain point and it crashes, yeah. They argued that governments shouldn't do anything to stimulate the boom, yeah, because then it leads to exacerbation of like speculation, and so people end up thinking, oh, the economy is like doing like really better than like the economy is doing better than it actually should be doing, like on paper. So it actually hides the genuine state of the economy and stuff, right? And then similarly, when the market crashes, right, they say that all these kind of efforts here to try and like stimulate like kind of like growth in that sense and to try and like level it off and stuff, right? All these things actually end up slowing the recovery and actually make the recession or depression much worse, right? So many of these ideas didn't really come to prominence yet until the period after the Great Depression and kind of like and midway through like World War II, right? So Friedrich Hayek, who again another Austrian, who he fled from the Nazis and stuff, came to work in the London School of Economics, and him and John Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, they were people. These were two economists, and we've mentioned them before, right, in our video on economics. These were two people who were cordial with each other, but who disagreed with each other on economics, right? So Keynes argued for more state intervention, and that basically it was like like the government could like regulate it could regulate like kind of like things to make sure that there was constant growth, and that if there was a recession, then they'd print more money or they'd borrow more, etc., and they'd whatever it was, like they need to just kickstart the engine like of the economy and get things fired up again, then they would, right? And so these two people really clash with each other, right? And again, we'll have links in the description for the world famous like kind of Keynes and Hayek like rap videos. To my understanding, neither of the two gentlemen actually took part in that. It was actors. No, joking. Obviously, it's actors. But yeah, those videos are really entertaining, and they'll go into the depths of things a lot better than I really could. But here's the thing. So in 1943, Friedrich Hayek recognized that, hold on, so we've just had a depression where the role the government's played in the economy has been absolutely huge. And we're in the middle of World War II, where everything is being planned centrally by the state, right? And, far from people thought that what happened in Nazi Germany or what happened in Soviet Russia could never happen in the West, because we're free societies, these things could never happen. But Hayek recognized that if you have literally everything planned, if you have everything rationed, if you have the government taking over industries, and just the whole society is just a war economy, right? And everything is controlled by the state. Even you having if you've not covered your the curtains or whatever, at night time and stuff, a warden comes around and goes, right, turn your lights off, and that level of control. Hayek said, right, it's fine in wartime, it's understandable in wartime. At the same time, it's a thing of it sets a dangerous precedent for what should be the norm in peacetime, right? And it goes back to the thing I said the other week when we talk about socialism. As Tony Benn said, if you can plan for war, why can't you plan for peace? So this was the arguments that people were already making during this time. So people said that the government's doing a pretty good job of controlling the economy during wartime. Why can't they also plan the economy and control the economy in peacetime? And so Hayek in 1943 wrote on the Road to Serfdom. The Road to Serfdom, right? So in that book, it really starts to lay out criticisms of central planning, of government control within industry and within like the nation in general, and it really starts to critique, even before it kind of happens, all of the kind of like post-war consensus that we end up with, like kind of, where the state is involved in so many different areas, right? And like taxes go up and spending goes up, and like the role of the government expands exponentially, right? And so before this even happened, Friedrich Hayek was criticizing it and was saying these are some of the logical conclusions that will end up happening from there. So not many people really want to listen to him, and in the post-war world, most economists went along with the kind of Keynesian model, and even ended up with Richard Nixon in the early 70s, saying the famous thing of we're all Keynesian now, right? So whether you're voting for a left-wing party or a right-wing party, everyone was voting. Everyone, didn't matter who you voted for, everyone was pushing the exact same economics. The only argument was about how far one would push that Keynesian model, right? So, and also as well, there was the argument that during the war, because you had unemployment before it, and you had all this war production during it, right? The argument was that actually state intervention, like kind of getting people to jobs and getting, like war. It was argued that the war ended the depression, that ended the mass unemployment, that it revitalized the economy, right? So again, all these kind of things, some people were opposing, right? And Friedrich Hayek got all the major economists, from the Austrian school, but also some thinkers from some economists from Britain and from America and many other places, right? And they all came together in the Mount Pelion, I never pronounce any French thing right, in 1947, so this is in Switzerland, right? And they all come together and start to think, right, how can we come together and work together to actually criticize the consensus that we're currently living in now. And bit by bit, over the decades, they start to, continually make these arguments, continually, go against the grain, continually be those voices in the wilderness that no one wants to listen to. But by the time it gets to the 1970s, people do start to listen because many of their predictions end up being right. So now we're going to talk about part of the journey that, that in between, like, we're going to talk about some of the journey in between, like, kind of the post-war world and the 1970s, right? So the first use of the term libertarian in the kind of modern US like definition that we commonly understand now was with Dean Russell. So in 1955, he really coined the terms in the way that we understand it today, where he said that the word liberal had been like corrupted by leftists, and so he basically took the word libertarian and made it synonymous with what had previously been called classical liberal, right? So this idea of, the kind of thing that Adam Smith was arguing for in terms of having like less state intervention with things and like allowing free trade and free markets and stuff, right? So this is when like the movement really starts becoming very popular in America, right? And people like Murray Rothbard, right? Kind of again, he was, so libertarianism has scales to it, right? And Murray Rothbard was one of the people who were these people were described as anarcho-capitalists, right? So these people who say, right, we shouldn't even have a government at all, right? Everything can be done privately, even private roads, private police, private army services, right? Which, probably practically speaking, is not it's probably unattainable and more than likely undesirable to take it to that extreme, because it's no one's ever really been able to work out as of yet how one would have. So, for instance, he argued for voluntary taxes. There's an argument to having elements of that, but to take it to the extreme of, like, if everyone decided that they weren't going to pay taxes at all, then how are the roads going to be built? At the end of the day, like, you need roads, and it's like, well, how are people going to, like, if one person on that road decides that they don't want to pay for it, then where do we really go from here? Like, and same thing with police force. Everyone benefits from certain like government spending. Like, people like benefit from those like programs and stuff. So if people decide en masse that they're not going to pay those things, then those things still have to be paid for. So then who's like footing the bill, right? But even still, like, so you start to see a very lively debate throughout the libertarian movement and stuff, right? In America in particular, right? So one of the main thinkers during this time was another economist who also went to the Mount Pelerin meeting, right? And this person was Milton Friedman, right? I think we've mentioned him before on the channel, but again, he's very influential person, and again, someone who was quite influential, like has been quite influential, like to me as well, right? Not in terms of necessarily everything that he said, but certain element, like large swaths of what he said, I think are quite correct, right? And he wrote in many books, but most famously he wrote in 1962 Capitalism and Freedom. Mixed up his name with it, whatever. Capitalism and Freedom, in which he argues, for having free markets, and argues against some of the excesses of the welfare state that we were starting to see in post-war like Western world, and basically saying that actually the Soviet Union, because we're in the middle of the Cold War now, right, has gone down the road of central planning, right, and we in the West are increasingly going down that road. The same argument that Hayek was saying, going down the road to serfdom. We're going down the road of less and less freedom, and more and more things of people just being tied to, like, people being tied to the people who are actually in control of them, and like the slow erosion of freedom, right? And he very much argued for more free markets, for more like kind of like choice, and this led on to his famous book that comes out in 1980, which is Free to Choose, which he ended up making like kind of a TV series from, which you can see on YouTube now. Again, I'll try and put the link in the description. Again, highly recommend like kind of like watching that, even if you're not that way inclined, even if like you think that libertarianism is a load of nonsense. It's still very good TV. It's very good. It's a very good documentary, and there's debates at the end of every show where they have people from a wide range of different political ideologies to actually really argue these ideas. And it's basically, if you look at how people debated things in the 1980s and compare it to how people debate things today on TV, it's literally like it's like day and night, honestly. So if you want to see some good quality like political and economic discussions on TV, go and look on YouTube at some of those, right? Right. So now we're finally getting to the 1970s. This is when things really start heating up, right? So in 1971, Richard Nixon took America off the gold standard, which had been the standard unit of exchange in which the dollar had been pegged to gold. And so the price of gold and the price of the dollar were intertwined with each other. So whenever you're exchanging with different currencies, that was what the world. That's how the world kind of like dealt with exchanges, right? So by America coming off the gold standard, we end up with what's referred to as fiat currency, where the currency is not really based on anything. It's just on purely pretty much on speculation and like the perceived like strength of the US economy. So David Nolan in 1971 sets up the Libertarian Party, right, of the US. And in 1974, we have Nozick, right, and he writes Anarchy, Anarchy, the State and Utopia, which is a book directly critiquing the works of John Rawls, right, who wrote Theory of Justice, right. So this is when we really start to see this kind of revivalism of kind of classical liberalism, like kind of during the 1970s, because in the context of what's happening in the 1970s, right, with the oil shock and this and that, and we have stagflation, so the rate of inflation keeps going up all the way up to 10%, 20%, etc. At the same time, the economy is stagnating after coming out of like 30 years of pretty much like non-stop growth, bar a few minor years, right? So the whole economy in the Western world starts to really being shaken, right? And like a lot of the things that people are just taking as a end up having to be questioned. And this is when you start to see the rise of political figures, right? Such as Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right? So actually, I forgot to say as well, in 1964, this is like the first time when a kind of libertarian-leaning person actually like becomes very prominent in US politics, right? So 1964, you have the election. So JFK had been killed the year before. Lyndon B. Johnson is running the Democrats, right? Now, the Republican Party up to that point had been basically run by moderates. Like if you think about like kind of Eisenhower, if you think of you think of all these kind of like leaders for around that time, and you had this kind of Republican Party led by kind of like northern kind of like liberal elites, like liberal / moderates, and these people didn't really want to upset the apple cart a bit. They wanted to basically have all the same things that the Democrats wanted, but with just minor tweaks. And here was this person, Barry Goldwater, who came up out of this kind of libertarian movement and argued very, very strongly for limited government, for powers to be sent back to the states, right? And for a real like U-turn in the direction that America was going in, right? And he famously quoted Virgil, like kind of the famous like kind of Roman, when he said, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the defense of virtue." Let's try and get that again, right? Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in the face of injustice is no virtue, right? So that quote is very, very powerful, even though I stumbled on saying it. But this allowed the Johnson campaign to be like, oh, he's an extremist, yeah? And so, during that election, he ended up like kind of like losing like very, very badly. It was like a landslide like defeat, right? But it set the ground for what would come in the following decades, right? And Ronald Reagan, who had previously been an actor up until that point, he first kind of got his foot in the political door during a speech, like in that campaign, which you can check on YouTube now. It's a very, very powerful speech. It's called A Time for Choosing, and that is literally the speech that's one of the most powerful speeches, regardless of whether you agree with him or not. That is one of the most powerful speeches ever written or ever spoken and stuff, right? It outlines everything that the man is thinking. At this point, he was just a private citizen he didn't really have like ambitions to be a president, but he outlines everything that he believes in and argues from a point of principle, which is something which we don't really see from politicians today, regardless of whether you're left or right. And it's also during this time that a lot of the main thinkers in libertarian circles really start to again argue about different things, right? So some people again want like no government at all. Some people want a bit of government, like Milton Friedman, and there's all these different like subsections of libertarianism. For instance, there's minarchism, which basically asks, like, kind of like calls for a minimalist state. So it basically says, right, we're going to have defense, and we're going to have military defense. We're going to have police and courts and all that stuff, and we're going to have roads, and that's it. And then there's other people like Milton Friedman who kind of argues for there to be a welfare state, but for it to be a very, very efficient one that only focuses on helping out the very poorest in society, and basically, having low taxes and low intervention for everyone else. And then we start having other thinkers as well, right? So there's a misconception that libertarianism is all just old white men, right? And judging from what we've been talking about so far, you would largely believe that. But there are many thinkers who are libertarian leaning, who do not fit that model. So famously, we have Ayn Rand, who was a Russian-born Jew, who emigrated. She emigrated like at the time of the Russian Revolution, or no, a little bit afterwards, right? And she was a very, very staunch. Probably because she had to like flee the Soviet Union. She's a very, very staunch critic of socialism and of like kind of collectivism in general, right? So she kind of argued for what she referred to as objectivism, which basically rejected like religion, it rejected conservatism, it rejected all these kind of things, right? And it even to the point of like critiquing like private charity. Like she said that the individual has only one kind of like goal in life, and that's to look after themselves and to kind of and to take care of like of himself, and to and let other people kind of like take care of themselves, because she argued that there's like that altruism is not a virtue, it's actually a vice, and that people are altruistic just because they want to make themselves feel better. They're not helping the situation, and B, like they're doing it for perverse reasons and stuff. And she argued that having this idea of that one should be charitable and one should like look after one's fellow man at the expense of oneself, was she referred to it as like a moral evil, right? So again, within the libertarian movement, many people argue against that, and people say that it kind of would lead to a very heartless society and stuff. But but regardless, again, whether you agree with her or not, she still argued those cases in a number of very famous literary books. So Atlas Shrugged is a very, very famous one. I believe it's one of the longest books ever written or something, right? The story of Atlas Shrugged is essentially a businessman who wants to build something, right? And all the politicians are trying to stop him, because they're like, oh, well, how does this benefit everyone else? And he said, I'm doing this for me, and I'm doing this so I can get profit, and everyone will benefit indirectly from this, right? And another famous book she wrote is The Fountainhead. Again, with the same, all of her books have the same kind of like vibe, where it's almost she like. I suppose for me as a script writer, and that's something I'll get onto in future videos. I don't tend to like stories which are just purely political. Like kind of there's room for it, but I think where sometimes one could do it subtly without making that before. The main point of being creative, is that one should be entertaining first, and if one wants to put in messages, then put them in subtly and stuff. But the main focus should be entertainment rather than kind of otherwise it kind of becomes a bit propagandary. That's just me. And also as well, you have the workings of Thomas Sowell, and Walter Williams, both of whom are African American, and both of them they use their position to, well, not just to kind of like argue those kind of like the typical kind of arguments that libertarians were arguing against, were arguing like for or against, right? But also because obviously they got a lot of backlash from being, black, right leaning people, right? A lot of their work is tied in with social commentary and kind of like dispelling many of the notions, the reason for ethnic minorities being like disadvantaged and stuff, and like basically many of their works kind of like look into they look into other reasons for it than just like everything's racism, and that's literally the only like reason for different groups having different places in the social high so in terms of they compare like kind of the economic situation of African Americans and compare it to other minorities that also have a history of oppression, be that Jews or be that like kind of Chinese, etc., and basically go like, well, hold on, these groups were persecuted as well, but they're actually above most white Americans. So surely racism itself cannot explain like. It can't tell all of the picture. It can tell some of it, but it can't tell all of it, right? So obviously people getting a lot of like backlash from that, and and both of these gentlemen like kind of lived well into the 21st century, and so the movement kind of it has this huge revival in like the 1970s. Its values start to really be implemented in terms of public policy in the 1980s with the premiership of Margaret Thatcher and with the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Margaret Thatcher famously was asked, what do we believe in? And she went into her purse and went into her handbag and took out a copy of the Road to Serfdom and said, this is what we believe in, right? So with those policies being implemented in the 1980s, it really fundamentally changed the way that the function of government, the scope of government, and no more were people really talking about like how big government could grow. It was more just thing of like, right, this is the size it is, and we're just gonna argue about tiny little things. But the idea of the government controlling everything, that idea had kind of gone out the window, and we had the neoliberal age, right? But in the world of the post like in the post recession, like the 2008 recession, right, the world after that, we start to see these ideas again make a revival, but as a counter to people making opposite arguments. People making arguments for authoritarianism, whether it be on the left or on the right. So all these ideas culminated in 2012 with the Republican primary for that year's election. And we saw the candidature of the famous politician Ron Paul. So he'd run several times before on a libertarian ticket, trying to be the president. But this time he's running as a Republican, and many of his ideas that he propagated, like kind of like during those primaries, such as having reducing the size and scope of the federal government, rolling back the extent of the state, giving back powers to the individual states in America and back to the people. So these ideas really became very, very popular, and they were infused with the Tea Party, the Tea Party movement at the time, and so they really started to challenge a lot of the orthodoxy that had existed for a long time. Because don't forget, Reagan and Thatcher, obviously they froze the expanse of the state, so it wasn't becoming any bigger. At the same time, government spending still was around the 40% mark, and the deficit was growing. Like all these kind of problems hadn't really kind of been dealt with in a way, right? And so this really was almost another revival of this kind of libertarian thought, right? And if we look at countries such as Singapore, if we look at countries such as Switzerland, if we look at countries such as Hong Kong, we see that actually, as opposed to having these kind of almost European style, like, well, obviously Switzerland's in Europe, yeah, but compared to the rest of Europe, Switzerland, instead of spending 40% of GDP, it spends on government, it spends about 25%, right? In places like Singapore and Hong Kong, it's between 12 and 15%, right? So, like, you know, and they still have welfare states, but they're very, very small, they're very efficient, and they focus more of their energy on helping the poor rather than helping like middle classes, because as Milton Friedman pointed out, most government spending, instead of going to the poor, actually ends up going to the middle classes, because if you have a system whereby you have universal benefits, yeah, like kind of whether it's education, healthcare, like kind of pensions, etc., right? You are going to end up with a system where people who otherwise probably could afford those things are still going to be given money like by the taxpayer. So you're going to have to tax everyone in society to give money to everyone in society. Whereas libertarians argue that actually we should be taxing the like people like who tend to be on like the higher end of the scale, right, a little bit, and use that money more efficiently to focus just on helping the very poorest in society, right? So these arguments, they're still about, yeah, they're still popular in certain circles, yeah. They haven't really reached the mainstream as of yet, but as we've discussed with many of these other political ideologies, yeah, just because something might not be popular at the moment, doesn't mean that it's completely gone away, right? As Tony Benn said, you know, there's no final victories, no final defeats, yeah, the struggle goes on. And so the debates about these different ideologies that we run through are, you know, they're going to just keep going on and on and on. There's always going to be people arguing for these sort of things. So hopefully these videos have given you guys a wider perspective of these different ideologies for you to be able to figure out on your own what ideologies speak more to you. So that being said, we're coming to the end of this video, and yeah, again, if you haven't liked or subscribed or written a comment, you know, please do. It really, really would help us out if you really like the videos and the quality of the content we're doing. Some of the videos I know are a bit long, but that's why we're also doing the clip videos on Tuesdays. So if your attention span kind of maxes out at about like 15-20 minutes, yeah, like those clips will be perfect for you. And yeah, so next week we're gonna, next video we're gonna be discussing feminism, and yeah, so we're going to be getting into some of the history of that. I know it's not necessarily an ideology, but it still is an important stream of thought within like politics, so we're going to label it as an ideology, even though people can be feminist and be anywhere on the political spectrum, but either way. So yeah, so again, have a good day, and see you next time. Bye.